Hi, I'm Joe Burr. Well, for our Huntington relatives, that would be Joe Beer. I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've lived here since 1974. Most of us Bir Stein family members are well aware of our history that centers around Huntington, Indiana, Battle Creek, Michigan, Ohio, and Marion, Indiana, where our grandparents raised the family. Grandpa Herman grew up in Huntington, about 30 miles from here, where his father worked for the Erie Railroad. Grandma Leaf Stein Burr grew up in Ohio, where her father was music director and headmaster of a women's school. But before Grandpa Burr ever met Grandma Burr, before they raised their big family in Marion, Grandpa had another life and another future right here in Fort Wayne. And it began somewhere after the turn of the last century. This is historic Fort Wayne. Well, a reproduction of Fort Wayne, an American outpost in the western frontier. It's located right across the river from the ancient Indian village of Kikianga. This was the capital of the once thriving Miami Indian community at the confluence of three rivers. Early French traders had a very valuable fur trade here. The French eventually set up a military outpost here, perhaps as much interested in gaining new land as they were in converting the natives to Catholicism. The British, too, had an interest in this territory and eventually gained control, only to be driven out by various Indian tribes before General George Washington sent troops to take control of the area. As was the sad fate of tribes across the United States, the Miami tribe was defeated and the first Fort Wayne was built in 1794. All that to say, a little more than 100 years after Fort Wayne was built, after the completion of the Wabash-Erie Canal, and after the growth of the railroad, German and Irish immigrants moved into northern Indiana for the plentiful industrial and railroad jobs. One immigrant, Francis Xavier Burr, was raising a family in Huntington, Indiana, about 30 miles from here. Francis grew up in a large Catholic family in Alsace-Lorraine, a large territory in Europe, sharing borders with the present-day France and Germany. After troubles at home, 20-year-old Francis sailed abroad to New York at the age of 20 in 1881. The ship he sailed to America aboard, which at the time was a well-known ship, it's mentioned in the opening pages of Jules Verne's novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And in 1871, Auguste Bartholdi had sailed to Perrier in a trip to convince America to let him build his greatest creation, the Statue of Liberty. Francis Xavier disembarked in New York and made his way to Pennsylvania, where he heard of work in Huntington, Indiana as a blacksmith for the Erie Railroad. In 1882, married Margaret Rodgaven, and in fairly quick succession, they had three boys, Frank, Joseph, and Herman. In 1891, when Francis's wife Margaret died, Francis, Herman, and his brothers were devastated. We don't know the cause of death, or sadly, much about her. This Huntington newspaper clipping mentioned her death. A year later, Francis Xavier married another German immigrant, Tracy Hauser, who eventually birthed 6 children of her own. The story has been told that sometime after Francis and Teresa were married and were busy raising children of her own, the 3 Burr boys were sent off to live with relatives in the country. It's also said that there were times when they sadly looked out the window toward home. I'm sure the premature death of his mother had a profound effect on Herman and foreshadowed another tragedy that was to impact his life a quarter century later. As a child, our grandfather showed not only artistic aspirations, but real skill. As a teen, he began work as a sign painter for various Huntington decorating and sign companies, the Wabash Valley Traction Company and the Swain Sign Painting Company. In fact, in 1904, 19-year-old Herman and his 20-year-old brother Joseph purchased the Swain Sign Painting Company. It was one of the many business adventures that Herman would attempt throughout his prodigious and creative but difficult life. A newspaper clipping in 1905 reported that Grandpa Burr fell through a hotel skylight at a job he was doing and suffered a broken back. He was hauled to the hospital in a horse-drawn carriage. The hotel later sent Herman a bill for the taxi. During that time, Herman made many trips to Fort Wayne. He took the interurban trains that connected so many towns. But during this time, Herman met a young woman named Anna O'Brien, and they soon picked up a courtship. Anna's family, the O'Briens, were a Fort Wayne family. It's our guess that somewhere between 1906 and 1907, Grandpa Burr moved to Fort Wayne and took a job painting interurban trains. He perhaps moved here to be near Anna, but also to further his education as an artist. Fort Wayne was a growing industrial city, home to many innovative companies, and had a massive German population. German was spoken around the Burr household as Herman was growing up. In Fort Wayne, Catholic churches held German language masses until the outbreak of World War I, when Germany became an archenemy of America. As was evident in much of his life, Herman tinkered around with many assorted jobs and artistic endeavors. In addition to sign painting, he was honing his skills at painting and decorating. He studied under various teachers and decorators. Aunt Celie told of a story of Herman's art teacher who said, "Herman, there's nothing more I can teach you." Herman painted a portrait of Anna somewhere in these years. In 1908, Herman married Anna O'Brien in Fort Wayne at St. Mary's Catholic Church, an historic and beautiful downtown church. This is St. Mary's Church today. The original was hit by lightning and destroyed in 1993. Herman and Anna took up residence here at this house in the city's south side. In 1909, Anna became pregnant with their first child. In the 1910 federal census, Herman is listed in Fort Wayne as a sign painter. Of note, the Stein family lived about 2 miles from Herman and Anna, but attended a different Catholic church. Anna gave birth to a baby boy in 1910, but their son Albert died 5 days after being born. The funeral was held here at St. Patrick's Catholic Church, which was Herman and Anna's church in those years. We don't know the story, but it's possible Anna was in ill health following the death of her son. In a 1914 newspaper clipping, Anna was reported seriously ill. A year later, in 1915, she died in this house, which was her sister's. Who was Anna O'Brien Burr? What were her passions and talents? We can only guess. By now, heartache had been a regular part of Grandpa Burr's life, and for the most part, for his life afterwards. He didn't talk much about his previous life, but I can certainly imagine the sadness in Grandpa's heart on the day she left his life. As a girl, Aunt Celie remembers finding Anna's wedding picture when her dad was away. She asked Grandma, "Who is that?" Grandma said, "That's Grandpa's first wife." That's the first she had ever heard of his first love.
Before I knew anything about it, I found a picture in Dad's cabinet, his large cabinet that had photographs, paintings, and this sort of thing. And in there was this picture of a nude lady, beautiful lady. And I pulled it out and I says to my dad, "Whoa, wow." And he immediately took it away from him and hid it. Now, I don't know where he hid it because I never saw it after that. But he wasn't real happy with me, going woo over it. But I had no idea who it was at that time. I was just a little guy.
Herman stayed in Fort Wayne, and he continued growing in his skills in oil painting and decorating. This clip from May of 1916 talks of Herman's artistry, notoriety, and success. He moved out of the house he had shared with Anna, and he went into an immediate tailspin, an emotional breakdown. His doctors suggested he enlist in the Army as a stabilizing force, and so he did. At the time he enlisted, his employer was O.J. Cover and Sons, well-known church decorators in the Midwest. At the time, the United States was fighting in the First World War in Europe. As Herman's unit was to be shipped out to France to fight, his commanding officer announced he needed a sign painter for an army base, Camp Taylor in Kentucky. Grandpa, though they say in the Army never volunteer, raised his hand. And so he became the base sign painter and illustrator, while the rest of his unit was shipped out. As the story goes, the ship was torpedoed and sank. Sometime during a leave, he heard the voice of a woman singing from the choir loft here at Precious Blood Catholic Church. He asked, "Who is that woman singing with the voice of an angel?" The woman was Bir Stein, the daughter of Precious Blood's choir master, Professor Clement J. Stein, and Catherine von der Haar Stein, both offspring of German immigrants. Clement and Catherine had married in 1892. Leaf, born a year later, was their eldest daughter. Clement Stein, who was an organ master and had been the head of a girls' school in Ohio, left the teaching profession due to health and now worked at the Fort Wayne News Sentinel while serving as organist and choir master at Precious Blood. His large family had moved to Fort Wayne from Ohio in 1909 and took up residence on the same block as Precious Blood, where they could walk to church in a heartbeat. The house is now gone, but it's easy to imagine the laughter and music that emanated from the Stein household. This newspaper article from 1970 shows the Stein family on the occasion of Clement and Catherine's 25th wedding anniversary. They had celebrated with a mass earlier in the day, with Oliva playing organ and her sisters Victoria, Josephine, Cecilia, and Ursula all sang the high mass. But Brother Anselm was away in the service and couldn't attend. During his military service, Herman painted Oliva a portrait of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music, which Catherine Stein was inclined to reject, saying Oliva couldn't accept such a fine gift from him, as they weren't engaged. But they were soon engaged. And Oliva was employed at General Electric in Fort Wayne and had been offered a sponsorship to study voice and opera at a school in Chicago. But her father Clement wouldn't hear of it, saying he wasn't going to let her lose her soul in the big Sin City. But her loss was our gain. Otherwise, she'd have never met Grandpa. In October of 1918, in the midst of a deadly worldwide Spanish flu pandemic that claimed millions of lives, Herman and Oliva were married in a quiet ceremony in the convent of Precious Blood Church. At that time, no public gatherings of any kind, including church services, were allowed for health reasons. Herman was scheduled to be shipped out to Europe to fight, but amazingly, the war ended less than 2 weeks later, and Grandpa never had to go. After his service, Herman and Oliva moved to Huntington to build a new life together, a life filled with children and laughter, heartache and struggle, but always one of deep faith and resilience. We knew Herman Burr as a loving husband, grandfather, artist, and inventor. We knew his weaknesses and struggles, but we knew his deep well of love, too. We knew Oliva Burr as a wonderful grandma, an amazing cook, an organist, a woman who survived a lifetime of challenges, a woman of great laughter and an amazing capacity to pray. Let's face it, we are the offspring of an amazing, creative, fun-filled, loving, but very human family. And I, for one, am very richly blessed to be a part of that story. There is so much more to this incredible saga and the adventure-filled life of the Burr Stein families in the 20th century. But for now, we'll have to save that story for another time. I'm Joe Burr.